The Scorched Hills of Arizona Territory, 1912. Thomas Redpath stands alone atop the ridge, watching buzzards circle what everyone calls the dead land. The parcel of reservation allotment nobody wanted. Not the government agents, not the white settlers, not even his own Apache relatives. They said the land was cursed, that nothing would ever grow there, that the wells always ran dry. They called him a fool when he accepted the deed. Yet Thomas sees what others miss. The faint rainbow sheen on waterstones. The way sagebrush grows stunted in a perfect circle. The strange smell that rises with the moon. Something valuable sleeps beneath this forgotten corner of the reservation. But what price will he pay to unearth it? Will the old legends prove true after all? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Redpath pulled his father's silver pocket watch from his vest. The timepiece had survived 3 decades of reservation life, government schools, and oil field work. Its face was scratched, the silver tarnished in places, but it kept perfect time, just like his father had. "You carry 2 worlds with you, son," his father had told him the day he presented Thomas with the watch. "One measured by the sun and stars, the other by minutes and seconds. Learn to live in both." Thomas had learned, though the price was steep. At age 8, government agents had loaded him onto a wagon bound for the Indian boarding school in Phoenix. There, they cut his hair, banned his language, and taught him the white man's ways. Thomas learned to read, write, and calculate. He absorbed everything they offered while keeping his Apache heart carefully hidden. When he returned to the reservation 6 years later, his mother barely recognized him. His father simply nodded, as if seeing exactly what he expected. Thomas straddled 2 realities now, fluent in English and mathematics, yet still able to track game and read the desert as his ancestors had. The reservation had changed during his absence. The government's allotment program had carved their communal lands into individual parcels. Some families received fertile ground near water. Others got rocky slopes or barren flats. The best portions mysteriously ended up in white settlers' hands through dubious transactions. Thomas left again at 19, finding work on Oklahoma oil rigs. For 5 years, he learned the machinery, the drilling techniques, the smell and behavior of crude oil. He sent most of his wages home, where drought and poor soil made traditional farming nearly impossible. When his father fell ill, Thomas returned. For 3 months, he sat beside the old man as consumption slowly claimed him. "Our people need a future," his father wheezed one night, gripping Thomas's wrist with surprising strength. "The old ways alone cannot save us now, but neither can we surrender who we are." After the burial, Thomas withdrew the money he'd saved and purchased drilling equipment at auction, cast-off pieces from bankrupted operations. Everyone thought him crazy, especially when no bank would lend to an Apache with wild ideas about finding oil on worthless reservation land. Then came the government's cleanup of leftover allotments. The agent, a thin man named Dawson with spectacles and perpetually ink-stained fingers, summoned remaining tribal members to the agency office. "Final parcels," he announced, slapping a stack of deeds on the scarred wooden desk. "Take one or leave it." Nobody wanted the parcel locals called the Dead Land. Stories circulated about livestock that wandered there and died mysteriously. About the strange ring of stunted mesquite trees. About water that sometimes smelled of sulfur and strange lights seen at night. When Thomas stepped forward to claim it, silence fell across the room. Even Dawson looked surprised. "You sure, Redpath? 50 acres of worthless dirt. Nothing grows there." "I'll take it," Thomas said, reaching for the deed. Later, Walking Bear, one of the tribal elders, cornered him outside the trading post. "That place is bad medicine," the old man warned, tobacco-stained breath clouding the air between them. "The ancestors say what sleeps there should remain sleeping." Thomas merely nodded respectfully. He had seen something on that ridge that others missed. something that reminded him of the Oklahoma fields. That evening, as he sat outside his small cabin reviewing his father's pocket watch, a wagon approached. Sarah Blackwood, the schoolteacher who had arrived the previous year, pulled her horse to a stop. Widowed, young, and determined to make her own way, she had earned grudging respect from both the reservation and town communities. "Mr. Redpath," she called, "I heard about your acquisition today." Thomas stood, surprised by the visit. "Mrs. Blackwood, I was wondering if I might speak with you about it. My late husband was a geologist before we came west." Thomas studied her for a moment. Her eyes held intelligence and something else, curiosity unburdened by the usual prejudice. "I'd be honored to hear what you know," he said, gesturing to the rough bench beside his door. As the sun set behind the distant mountains, casting long shadows across the reservation, they began a conversation that would change everything. The land deed sat on Thomas's small table, its edges curled from handling, a faint coffee stain in one corner. The official seal of the Bureau of Indian Affairs caught the morning light. His name, written in Agent Dawson's precise handwriting. Thomas Redpath, owner of 50 acres in Section 23, Township 11. The land nobody wanted. Thomas folded the document carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket. Today he would walk the boundaries of his property, officially staking his claim. The trading post was unusually crowded when he arrived to purchase supplies. Conversation died as he entered. Thomas nodded politely, moving to the counter where Jacob Miller, the proprietor, waited with thinly disguised amusement. "Heard you took the dead land," Miller said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Reckon they'll find your bones out there come winter." A few chuckles rippled through the store. Thomas placed his order calmly. 5 wooden stakes, 50 feet of rope. Hammer. Miller smirked. "Planning to mark your gravesite?" Thomas counted coins onto the counter. "Just marking what's mine." Sarah Blackwood entered, her presence temporarily diverting attention. She wore a practical dark blue dress, her brown hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat. Thomas noted how the settlers straightened in her presence. The schoolteacher commanded respect even as a woman alone. "Mrs. Blackwood," Miller called, "you hear about Redpath's folly? Took the cursed allotment out past Bitter Creek." Sarah approached the counter, setting down her basket. "I believe congratulations are in order, Mr. Redpath. New property is always an opportunity." Her eyes met his, conveying something more than casual support. "Much obliged," Thomas replied. Outside, Sarah fell into step beside him. "They don't understand what you see." "Most don't bother looking," Thomas answered. "My husband would have. Edward always said Arizona Territory had undiscovered resources." She hesitated. "I still have his books and instruments. If they'd be useful." Before Thomas could respond, a group of Apache men approached, walking bare at their center. The old man's face was solemn. "The council wishes to speak with you," he said in their native tongue. Thomas nodded. "I will come. Now," Walking Bear insisted. Thomas glanced at Sarah apologetically. "Another time," she said, understanding. "Good day, Mr. Redpath." The tribal council had gathered in the shade of the large cottonwood that marked the center of their community. Elders sat in a semicircle, faces grave. Thomas took his place, waiting respectfully. Gray Horse, the eldest, spoke first. "You have taken the forbidden land." "I have taken land no one wanted," Thomas corrected gently. "No one wanted it because it is dangerous," said another elder, talks much. "The stories go back to our grandfather's time." "What stories?" Thomas asked, though he had heard whispers all his life. Gray Horse gestured. "A hunting party made camp there long ago. By morning, all were dead, their bodies twisted. No wounds, no sickness, just death. The earth breathes poison there," added Walking Bear. "Animals avoid it. Plants grow wrong. Other stories tell of fire coming from the ground, said Thomas. Of stones that burn, of water that catches flame. The elders exchanged glances. Yes, Grey Horse admitted. The old ones speak of such things. What if those aren't curses? Thomas leaned forward. What if they're signs? Signs of what? Talks much demanded. Oil, like the fields in Oklahoma where I worked. Black gold that the white man's world pays fortunes to possess. Silence fell. Several elders shook their heads. You have spent too much time in the white man's schools, said Walking Bear. You see with their eyes now. I see with both, Thomas replied. Our people need more than what the reservation offers. We need money for food, medicine, to buy back our land someday. Grey Horse raised a hand for silence. The spirits of that place are powerful, Thomas Redpath. If you disturb them, the consequences will fall on you alone. The council will not support this. I understand, Thomas said, rising. I ask only that you do not stand against me. He left the council circle with mixed feelings. Their blessing would have meant much, but their neutrality was better than opposition. At sunset, Thomas stood on his land, hammering the final boundary stake into the hard earth. The deed in his pocket represented more than ownership. It was possibility, a chance to prove that living in two worlds could bring strength rather than division. In the fading light, he noticed something he'd missed before. A perfect circle of stones, half buried in the soil, too regular to be natural, too ancient to be settlers' work. Thomas knelt, brushing dust from one stone. Beneath the surface grime, the rock was black and slightly oily to the touch. Thomas carried the tar-covered stone in his pocket for a week, occasionally taking it out to examine its properties. The rock had come from the creek bed that cut through the eastern edge of his property. What others saw as a curse, he recognized as nature's signpost. He had spent every daylight hour exploring his land, documenting each unusual feature in a small notebook. The circle of stones, the stunted ring of mesquite, the area where no vegetation grew at all. Most telling were the places where water seeped from the ground carrying a rainbow sheen and that unmistakable petroleum smell. Thomas knelt by one such seep now, watching how the oily film spread across the surface of a small puddle. He dipped a finger, rubbed the substance between thumb and forefinger. Not strong, but definitely there. In Oklahoma, he had learned that such signs often indicated deeper reservoirs. But without proper equipment, he could only guess at what lay beneath. And guesses wouldn't convince anyone to invest. The First Territorial Bank of Arizona occupied a brick building in town, its imposing facade designed to suggest stability and wealth. Thomas straightened his best shirt, tucked his evidence stones into a small pouch, and stepped inside. Mr. Hargrove, the bank manager, barely looked up from his ledger. No, sir, I haven't even stated my business, Thomas said. You want a loan? Hargrove's pen continued scratching across the page. The answer is no. I have collateral. 50 acres. On the reservation. Hargrove finally looked up, removing his spectacles. Worthless land that even your own people avoid. Land you don't truly own because the government can reclaim it anytime. There's oil on that land, Thomas said, placing the stones on the desk. Like the Oklahoma fields. Hargrove glanced at the rocks without touching them. Mr. Redpath, even if there were, which I strongly doubt, no bank would finance an Indian's oil venture. Good day. Thomas gathered his stones, dignity intact but hopes diminished. Outside, he nearly collided with Sarah Blackwood. Mr. Redpath, she said, her eyes noting his expression. Trouble at the bank? Nothing unexpected, he replied. Sarah glanced through the window at Hargrove, now fawning over a white rancher. Their loss, perhaps. She hesitated. Have you had time to consider my offer? Edward's books and instruments. Thomas studied her. Why was this white woman so interested in his venture? Why would you help me, Mrs. Blackwood? Her eyes held his steadily. Because my husband would have. And because this territory needs people who see possibilities instead of limitations. She adjusted her gloves. Tea at my cottage? I can show you what I have. The schoolteacher's home sat at the edge of town. Not quite in, not quite out, much like its occupant. Inside was surprisingly modest, but for one wall entirely covered with bookshelves. Edward's collection, Sarah explained, running her fingers along the spines. Geology, chemistry, engineering. She pulled down a volume titled Petroleum Exploration, Modern Techniques. Inside were detailed illustrations of oil derricks, drilling equipment, and geological formations. He was surveying for the railroad when we met, she continued, setting out tea. He believed Arizona had untapped resources that would someday rival Pennsylvania's oil fields. Thomas carefully turned pages, finding diagrams that matched what he'd observed in Oklahoma. What did you find on your land? Sarah asked. Thomas described the seeps, the stone circle, the strange patterns of vegetati. With each detail, Sarah's expression grew more animated. Surface indicators, she confirmed. Edward would say you need to test the depth. Equipment I can't afford, Thomas reminded her. Sarah studied him over her teacup. Perhaps not alone. That evening, returning to his cabin, Thomas found 3 Apache boys waiting nervously. The youngest, just 12, thrust out a cloth bundle. Grandfather said to bring you these. Inside were dried herbs and a small medicine pouch, traditional protection against evil spirits. Walking Bear sent you? The boy nodded. He says you are foolish, but you are still our blood. Thomas smiled. Tell him I am grateful. Later, examining his land deed by lamplight, Thomas considered his position. The bank had refused him. The tribal council offered no support beyond spiritual protection. His only potential ally was a white widow with books and memories. Yet somehow the obstacles strengthened his resolve. Thomas placed the tar-covered stone on the deed, a physical promise to the land and himself. Tomorrow he would begin testing soil samples. He would map the property properly. He would find proof no one could deny. And if the cursed land truly held the future of his people, Thomas Redpath would be the one to unlock it. Sarah's geology textbook lay open on a flat rock, its pages weighed down by stones against the persistent breeze. Thomas knelt beside it, comparing the diagram of sedimentary formations with the exposed rock face before him. Her late husband's penciled notes in the margins provided insights no published text could offer. The way these layers tilt suggests a dome structure beneath, Sarah said, pointing to the outcropping. She had abandoned her usual teaching attire for a practical skirt and blouse, her hair tied back simply. 3 weeks of fieldwork had erased any pretense of formality between them. Like the salt domes in Texas? Thomas asked, recalling stories from fellow workers in Oklahoma. Precisely. Sarah's eyes lit with enthusiasm. Edward always said anticlines were nature's oil traps. Their unlikely partnership had begun tentatively, Sarah offering books, Thomas sharing observations. But soon they were spending every available hour on his land, collecting samples, mapping features, testing soil composition with the simple chemistry set Edward Blackwood had left behind. In town, their collaboration raised eyebrows. Thomas heard the whispers. The Indian who thought himself a geologist, the white widow forgetting her place. Some comments were merely curious. Others held darker implications. Sheriff Willard had stopped by the schoolhouse last week, ostensibly checking on Sarah's welfare. Folks are talking, Mrs. Blackwood, he'd warned. A respectable woman, spending time alone with... Well, you understand the concern. Mr. Redpath and I are conducting scientific research, Sarah had replied coolly. Any concern about my reputation is misplaced and unwelcome. The school board proved less easily dismissed. Yesterday's letter had been explicit. Her position would be reconsidered if certain inappropriate associations continued. Sarah hadn't mentioned this to Thomas. Instead, she'd brought her husband's prized brass microscope to examine soil samples more closely. "There," she said now, straightening from the rock face. "See how the limestone is fractured? That's often a pathway for oil migration." Thomas nodded, making notes in his journal. In Oklahoma, they'd already be drilling with evidence like this. "In Oklahoma, you wouldn't need to prove yourself twice over," Sarah replied quietly. Thomas glanced at her. "Why risk your position for this venture, Mrs. Blackwood?" Sarah was silent for a moment, gazing across the stark landscape. "When Edward died, many suggested I return east to my parents. A widow has limited options," they said. Her voice hardened. "I've spent my life being told what I couldn't do because I was female. You're told what you can't do because you're Apache. Perhaps I recognize a kindred spirit." She turned, meeting his eyes directly. "And perhaps I believe in science above prejudice. The evidence suggests oil. That fact doesn't change because of who discovers it." Thomas studied this remarkable woman who defied convention as readily as he did. "Sarah," he said, using her given name for the first time, "I cannot pay you for your expertise. I'm not asking for payment. I'm proposing a partnership." She closed the textbook decisively. "My knowledge and instruments, your land and experience, equal share in whatever we find. People will talk even more. People always talk. I prefer to give them something worthwhile to discuss." She extended her hand formally. "Partners." Thomas hesitated only briefly before clasping her hand. "Partners." That evening, they mapped out next steps over dinner at Sarah's cottage. The lamp-illuminated diagrams and calculations spread across her table. "We need to test at depth," Sarah explained, sketching a simple drilling apparatus. "Edward designed this for preliminary exploration. It won't reach oil, but it will bring up soil samples from deeper layers." "I can build this," Thomas said, studying the design. "But we'll need proper equipment eventually. One step at a time." Sarah smiled. "First we prove there's something worth drilling for." As Thomas prepared to leave, Sarah disappeared into her bedroom, returning with a small box. "Edward's pocket watch," she said, opening it to reveal a tarnished timepiece. "It has a compass function. It might be useful in your surveys." Thomas recognized the gesture's significance. "I'll take good care of it." "I know you will." Walking home beneath the star-filled sky, Thomas felt a cautious optimism. His hand rested on his father's watch in one pocket, Edward Blackwood's in the other. Two timepieces from two different worlds, yet both pointing toward the future. The hand-carved drill bit gleamed in the sunlight, its cutting edge sharp and precise. Thomas rotated it slowly, examining his handiwork. Unlike standard bits from the supply catalogs, this one featured modifications based on both his oil field experience and traditional Apache knowledge of the local stone. "Will it work?" asked Little Fox, a young man from the reservation who had been one of the few willing to help. "We'll find out tomorrow," Thomas replied, setting the bit beside others of various sizes. Each represented hours of careful work at the blacksmith's forge in town, paid for with his dwindling savings. The wooden derrick rose 20 feet above them, not the towering steel structures of established oil fields, but sturdy and functional. Thomas had designed it using principles learned in Oklahoma, adapted to their limited resources. The main support beams came from abandoned ranch buildings. The pulleys were repurposed from farm equipment. Every piece had been hauled to the site by wagon, then assembled by hand. Sarah arrived as they were securing the drilling platform, her wagon loaded with supplies. 3 weeks into construction, her initial visits had drawn such gossip that she now came only when necessary, though her financial contribution had proven essential. "The school board called a special meeting," she said quietly as they unloaded canvas for a storage tent. "Tomorrow evening." Thomas paused. "About your position?" "Ostensibly about curriculum requirements. But yes, it's about me. She straightened, pushing hair from her face. It doesn't matter. The equipment from Phoenix arrived at the station. We can collect it next week. Sarah, Thomas began, concerned. Don't. Her voice was firm. I've made my choice. Little Fox approached, nodding respectfully to Sarah. Someone's been here, he said in Apache. Last night. Thomas followed him to the base of the derrick. Fresh boot prints circled the structure, different from their own. Near one support beam, wood shavings suggested someone had been cutting into the timber. Sabotage? Sarah asked, observing their inspection. Perhaps. Thomas examined the beam closely, finding a partial cut disguised to look like a natural split. We'll replace it before continuing. That evening, as Thomas worked on the replacement beam by lantern light, two figures approached on horseback. He recognized Sheriff Willard and James Preston, owner of the largest cattle ranch in the county. Quite a contraption, Redpath, Preston called, remaining mounted while the sheriff dismounted. Folks are curious what you're building out here. Testing equipment, Thomas replied neutrally, setting down his tools. Preston chuckled. Some say you're hunting for oil. On reservation land. He shook his head. Ambitious. Is there a problem, Sheriff? Thomas asked directly. Willard cleared his throat. Just checking things out. Heard there might be safety concerns with your operation. The structure is sound, Thomas assured him. We're taking all proper precautions. Preston raised an eyebrow. Heard the schoolteachers involved. Shame to see a respectable widow mixed up in. He gestured vaguely. Questionable enterprises. Thomas maintained his composure. Mrs. Blackwood is a scientific advisor. Her late husband was a geologist. Scientific advisor, Preston repeated, smirking at the sheriff. That what they're calling it these days? Willard at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. Just be careful, Redpath. Accidents happen easily with makeshift equipment. After they departed, Thomas inspected the entire structure again. The partially cut beam wasn't an accident. It was a warning. The question was, from whom? Suspicious settlers? Competitors who somehow believed his claim had value? Or even tribal members who feared he would awaken something best left dormant? The next morning brought 4 more Apache men to the site, friends of Little Fox who had decided to offer their labor. With additional hands, they completed the drilling platform and installed the hand-powered lifting mechanism. Tomorrow we begin, Thomas told them, distributing the final day's wages from his nearly empty money pouch. After they left, Thomas climbed to the top of the derrick, surveying his land in the fading light. From this height, he could see the perfect circle where vegetation grew strangely, the dry creek bed where he'd found the tar-stained rocks, the ridge where Sarah had identified promising geological formations. What secrets are you hiding? He whispered to the land. The wind picked up as darkness fell, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Thomas descended and checked each support once more before heading to his tent. The drill bit he'd carved rested on a wooden crate beside his bedroll, the tool that would begin their search for truth tomorrow. As he extinguished his lamp, a strange glow seemed to flicker briefly over the circle of stunted mesquite trees. Thomas watched, but it didn't reappear. Perhaps just moonlight on mica in the soil, he reasoned. Or perhaps the old stories held some truth after all. Dawn painted the horizon with streaks of orange and gold as Thomas secured the eagle feather bundle to the derrick's highest point. The sacred object, weathered and simple, contained prayers and offerings wrapped in buckskin and bound with sinew. His presence surprised him as much as anyone. The previous evening, Walking Bear had arrived at the drilling site, accompanied by Gray Horse and 3 other elders. Thomas had been checking equipment when their wagon approached. We have considered your path, Walking Bear said without preamble. It is not our way, but you are still our blood. Gray Horse, the oldest of the group, leaned heavily on a gnarled staff. The council has decided. If you will disturb this place, it must be done with respect. We will perform the ceremony at sunrise." Thomas had stood speechless, then finally managed, "I am honored." Now, as first light touched the derrick, a small gathering assembled at its base. The elders, solemn in their ceremonial attire, Little Fox and the other Apache workers, and, to Thomas's surprise, Sarah Blackwood, standing slightly apart, her posture respectful but uncertain. Thomas approached her quietly. "You don't need to be here. I'm your partner," she replied simply. "Should I leave?" Thomas considered, then shook his head. "Stay, but follow my lead." Gray Horse began the ceremony, his voice rising in the ancient songs that asked permission from the earth and its spirits. Sweet smoke from burning sage and cedar wafted through the morning air as Walking Bear moved slowly around the derrick, purifying the structure. Thomas participated fully, responding when required, offering tobacco at the appropriate moments. The familiar rituals transported him back to childhood, before the government school, when such ceremonies were the rhythm of Apache life. The elders called Thomas forward. He knelt before them as Walking Bear tied a medicine pouch around his neck. "For protection," the old man explained. "What sleeps here is powerful. It may not wish to be awakened." Thomas accepted the gift solemnly. "I will proceed with respect." Gray Horse spoke next, his voice carrying surprising strength. "The old stories say this place holds both destruction and creation. Like fire, it can warm your home or burn it down." He fixed Thomas with an intense gaze. "Control what you unleash, or it will control you." After the men completed their prayers, Mourning Dove, one of the tribal's most respected medicine women, stepped forward with a clay bowl. Inside was a mixture of cornmeal and herbs. "For the woman," she said, looking towards Sarah. Thomas glanced back, surprised. Sarah stood hesitantly at the edge of the circle. "She is part of this now," Mourning Dove said simply. "The spirits know." Thomas motioned Sarah forward. She approached cautiously, her eyes questioning. "An offering," Thomas explained quietly. "A blessing for protection." Sarah knelt as directed. Mourning Dove made a small mark on her forehead with the mixture, then spoke softly in Apache. Though Sarah couldn't understand the words, the intent was clear in the old woman's gentle touch. When the ceremony concluded, Gray Horse presented Thomas with the eagle feather bundle. "Tie this to your drilling place. It will stand between your work and the old powers." The elders departed soon after, leaving Thomas and Sarah standing in silence as the workers began preparing for the day's tasks. "What did the medicine woman say to me?" Sarah finally asked. Thomas hesitated. "She asked the ancestors to recognize you as a friend to our people, to extend their protection to you." Sarah absorbed this. "I'm honored, and somewhat surprised they would include me." "As was I," Thomas admitted. "But they see what is, not what others think should be." They turned to the derrick, now blessed by tradition even as it represented progress. "Does this change how you feel about our venture?" Sarah asked. Thomas considered the question. "It reminds me that we must proceed thoughtfully, with awareness of what we might disturb. The geological or the spiritual? Perhaps they're not as separate as we think." Thomas touched the medicine pouch at his neck. "Ready to begin?" Sarah nodded, and they walked together toward the derrick, where Little Fox was already organizing the day's equipment. As they approached, Thomas noticed something unusual, a circular pattern of moisture on the ground directly beneath the drilling position, though no rain had fallen. The earth releasing its water, as sometimes happened before significant events. Or perhaps, as the elders might say, the land itself was responding to their intentions. Either way, Thomas thought, today they would break ground and begin the search for truth beneath the cursed land. The broken drill shaft lay on a wooden crate beside Thomas's tent, a stark reminder of their third failure in 2 weeks. The metal had sheared clean through after striking something impossibly hard at 47 feet. Thomas ran his fingers along the jagged edge, contemplating what had gone wrong. Could be a layer of caliche, Sarah suggested, examining soil samples through Edwards' brass microscope, or perhaps basalt intrusion. Thomas shook his head. I've drilled through both before. This was different. The vibration before it broke. He paused, searching for words. It felt alive. Sarah glanced up, concern in her eyes. You're exhausted. We all are. She wasn't wrong. Their days had settled into a punishing rhythm. Drilling from dawn until the light failed, fighting equipment failures, measuring minuscule progress. The Apache workers remained loyal but increasingly skeptical. Even Little Fox had begun making the sign against evil when he thought Thomas wasn't looking. Their finances were stretched thinner than the worn leather of Thomas's boots. Sarah had contributed her small savings, and Thomas had sold his horse. Each broken piece of equipment required creative repairs they could ill afford. We need proper geological surveys, Sarah said, closing her notebook. These samples show promising indicators, but we're drilling blind. Surveys cost money, Thomas reminded her, and attract attention we don't need. News of their operation had spread. Curiosity seekers occasionally appeared at the site's perimeter. Some merely watched. Others shouted mockery or warnings. More concerning were the visitors in expensive suits who observed silently, then departed without introduction. I checked the drill bit design again, Thomas said, changing the subject. Tomorrow I'll forge a stronger one. And if that fails too? Thomas had no answer. The broken shaft seemed to mock their efforts, a physical manifestation of the whispers growing in town. That Thomas Redpath was wasting the schoolteacher's money on foolish dreams. That the cursed land was claiming new victims. That night, alone in his tent, Thomas studied the maps they had meticulously created. Their test holes formed a grid across the most promising section of land, each marked with depth reached and materials encountered. The pattern revealed nothing new, the same frustrating mix of sandstone, clay, and occasional limestone that Sarah identified as promising for oil deposits, yet yielded nothing but broken equipment. A sudden gust of wind shook the canvas. Outside, the circle of stunted mesquite trees seemed to whisper with the breeze. Thomas found himself thinking of Gray Horse's warning about awakening something that wished to remain sleeping. He shook off the thought. This was geology, not superstition. There were scientific explanations for their difficulties. Dawn brought unexpected hope. Sarah arrived with a letter from a former colleague of her husband's, a professor of geology who offered limited assistance in analyzing their samples. We need to send him fresh cores from at least 60 feet, she explained. First we need to reach 60 feet, Thomas replied, securing the newly forged drill bit to the shaft. They began again, the workers turning the hand crank that powered the drill in two-man shifts. Thomas monitored the bit's progress, alert for any change in vibration or resistance. By midday, they had surpassed their previous depth record. 50 feet, Thomas announced, marking the drill line. We're entering new territory. The workers exchanged glances but kept turning. The familiar grinding sound continued steadily until, suddenly, it changed. A hollow note replacing the solid resistance. Stop! Thomas called, excitement rising. We've hit a cavity. Sarah hurried over as Thomas began extracting the drill. A natural cave? Or a pocket in the formation? Either way, it's new. The drill emerged slowly, its spiral grooves packed with material. Thomas and Sarah carefully collected samples, storing them in glass jars labeled with the depth. It's different, Sarah said, examining a chunk under her pocket magnifying glass. More granular, almost sandy, but dark. And there's a smell. Thomas caught it too, the faint but distinctive petroleum odor that had drawn him to this land initially. This goes to your professor immediately. As they prepared to resume drilling, The ground emitted a low groan, more felt than heard. The workers stopped, alarmed. "Just pressure equalizing in the cavity," Thomas assured them, though he was less certain than he sounded. They continued more cautiously, advancing only 5 more feet before the light failed. Thomas secured the site for the night, placing their precious new samples in Sarah's wagon. "Progress at last," she said, preparing to depart. "Though strange." "What?" Thomas asked. "The cavity. It shouldn't be there, not in this type of formation." She gathered her shawl against the evening chill, almost as if something created it. After she left, Thomas stood alone by the derrick, contemplating the broken drill shaft he kept as a reminder of their struggles. Beneath his feet, something waited. Whether blessing or curse, treasure or danger, he was now certain of one thing: the land held secrets worth discovering. The school deed lay on Thomas's makeshift desk, its official county seal catching the afternoon light. He stared at the document, unable to fully comprehend what Sarah was proposing. "It's not a gift," she said firmly, standing across from him. "It's an investment." "You're mortgaging your schoolhouse," Thomas replied, still processing the implications. "Your home. The building is mine. One of the few advantages of widowhood, property rights." Her voice was steady, but Thomas noticed her hands fidgeting with her locket. "The bank approved a loan against it this morning." Thomas looked up sharply. "Hargrove? The same banker who refused me?" "The same." A small, satisfied smile played at her lips. "Though he was considerably more polite to me, especially when I mentioned my cousin's position at the Territorial Education Board." The sum written on the bank draft beside the deed made Thomas's breath catch. It would cover proper drilling equipment, pipe casing, even hired help with actual experience. "This is too much risk," he said finally. "Sarah, if we fail, I lose a building. If we succeed," she gestured toward his land beyond the tent flap, "everything changes." The past week had intensified their partnership in unexpected ways. The samples they'd sent to Sarah's professor had returned with a promising analysis, indicators consistent with petroleum deposits at deeper levels. More significantly, Sarah had been dismissed from her teaching position, not officially for her association with Thomas, but for curriculum irregularities that fooled no one. "The school board has made their decision," she said, reading his thoughts. "This changes nothing." "It changes everything," Thomas countered. "You've lost your position because of me." "Because of narrow minds and petty prejudice," Sarah corrected. "I chose this partnership with open eyes, Thomas." He studied her face, seeing determination but also something more vulnerable. "Why?" he asked softly. "Truly, why risk everything on this venture?" Sarah was silent for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "When Edward died, I had 2 choices: return east to my family as a dependent widow, or forge my own path here. I chose independence." She met his gaze directly. "The same independence you seek for yourself and your people." She moved to the tent opening, looking out at the derrick silhouetted against the afternoon sky. "Besides, the science is sound. Your instincts were correct. There's oil here. I'm certain of it now." Thomas joined her, standing closer than propriety might allow. "And if there's more than oil? If the old stories hold some truth, then we'll face that too," she replied. Together, the moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken implications. Thomas was acutely aware of how this would appear to others: an Apache man and a white widow, alone in his tent, discussing a shared future. Yet, in this liminal space they'd created, conventional boundaries seemed increasingly irrelevant. The spell broke at the sound of approaching horses. Thomas stepped outside to find Sheriff Willard and 2 members of the school board. "Mrs. Blackwood," called Willard, removing his hat. "We've come to escort you back to town." "I don't require an escort, Sheriff," Sarah replied, emerging from the tent with perfect composure. "We've heard concerning reports," said Hargrove, one of the board members, "about your situation here. My situation is perfectly proper. Mr. Redpath and I are business partners." Hargrove's gaze shifted to Thomas, contempt barely concealed. "Mrs. Blackwood, you've been seen here at inappropriate hours. Your reputation—" "My reputation," Sarah interrupted, "is not your concern, nor is my private business." "The loan," Hargrove said, lowering his voice. "The bank could reconsider." "The papers are signed," Sarah cut him off. "Unless you're suggesting the First Territorial Bank doesn't honor its contracts?" Thomas admired her steel but worried about the growing hostility. "Perhaps you should return to town," he suggested quietly. "We can continue tomorrow." Sarah hesitated, then nodded slightly. "I'll fetch my wagon." As she gathered her things, Thomas faced the three men. "Mrs. Blackwood has invested in a legitimate business venture. Any suggestion otherwise is both false and disrespectful." "Careful, Redpath," Willard warned. "People are watching this arrangement." After they departed, Thomas studied the school deed again. The risk Sarah had taken went beyond financial investment. She had tied her fate to this land, to whatever lay beneath it. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders, as heavy and real as the medicine pouch that hung around his neck. That night, he worked by lantern light, drafting plans for the improved drilling operation her money would fund. With proper equipment, they could reach the depths necessary to prove or disprove his theory once and for all. As he worked, the wind picked up, carrying a strange, sweet scent from the circle of stunted mesquite. Thomas paused, listening to the night sounds of the desert. For a moment, he could have sworn he heard his name whispered on the breeze, called by a voice neither human nor animal. The clay oil lamp cast flickering shadows across the tent walls as Thomas carefully poured a small amount of the dark liquid into its basin. The crude lamp was his own creation, fashioned after designs his grandmother had shown him as a child, but modified to test the properties of the oily substance they'd extracted from their latest core samples. Outside, lightning flashed across the distant mountains, followed by the low rumble of thunder. The storm had been building all afternoon, promising rare and welcome rain to the parched land. The workers had departed early, leaving Thomas alone at the site with their newly delivered equipment still crated and waiting. Sarah had gone to Phoenix to meet with potential investors, her idea, after their most recent samples had shown even more promising signs. They needed additional capital to proceed with a full-scale operation if they struck oil. Thomas struck a match and touched it to the lamp's wick. The flame caught immediately, burning with a steady, bright light, further confirmation that what they'd found was indeed petroleum. The thunder grew closer. Thomas secured the tent flaps and settled onto his bedroll, reviewing the site maps one more time. Their new drilling location had been carefully selected based on Sarah's geological analysis. A promising spot near the eastern edge of the property, where several indicators converged. Yet something felt wrong. Thomas couldn't identify the source of his unease, but it had been growing for days. The dream of discovering oil remained vivid, but the location Sarah had chosen didn't feel right, despite all scientific evidence supporting it. The storm broke with sudden fury. Rain hammered the canvas roof, and wind threatened to tear the tent from its moorings. Thomas extinguished the lamp and moved to secure the entrance. But as he reached for the flap, a blinding flash of lightning struck somewhere very close, accompanied by a deafening crack of thunder. The impact threw him backward. For several moments, Thomas lay dazed, ears ringing, vision swimming with afterimages of the brilliant flash. As his senses slowly returned, he became aware of a strange silence. The rain continued to fall. He could see it through the partially open tent flap, but he couldn't hear it. Then came the voice. "Not there. Here." Thomas sat up abruptly, searching the dark tent. He was alone, yet the voice had been as clear as if someone stood beside him. "Who's there?" he called. No answer came, but when he looked toward the tent opening, he saw a faint blue glow in the distance, exactly where the circle of stunted mesquite trees stood. Thomas hesitated only briefly before pulling on his coat and stepping out into the downpour. The rain soaked him instantly, but he barely noticed as he made his way toward the mysterious light. The blue glow pulsed gently, seeming to hover just above the ground in the center of the mesquite circle. As Thomas approached, the rain appeared to lessen, though it continued to fall heavily everywhere else. He stopped at the edge of the circle, remembering the tribal elders' warnings. The blue light coalesced, taking a vaguely human shape. Thomas felt no fear, only a deep sense of recognition. "Grandfather," he whispered. The figure didn't respond directly, but Thomas felt rather than heard words forming in his mind. The old place. Dig at the old place. Images flashed through his consciousness. The stone circle he had discovered months ago, the exact spot where an ancestral fire pit had been. Not 50 yards from where they had originally started drilling, before Sarah's scientific approach had led them elsewhere. "Why there?" Thomas asked. The figure began to fade, but before it disappeared completely, Thomas understood one final message. What sleeps wishes to be found. Thunder crashed again, and suddenly the rain's roar returned to his ears. The blue light vanished, leaving Thomas alone in the storm, soaked to the skin but filled with absolute certainty. When dawn broke, the storm had passed, leaving the desert washed clean and the air charged with that distinctive after-rain scent. Thomas had not slept. Instead, he had spent the night redrawing maps, calculating depths, and making new plans. When Sarah's wagon appeared on the horizon, he was already moving equipment to the stone circle. "Thomas?" she called, confusion evident as she approached. "What are you doing?" "The drilling site is on the eastern section." He straightened, meeting her questioning gaze. "We need to move the operation here to the stone circle." Sarah frowned, dismounting. "But all our surveys, the geological indicators." "I know," Thomas said simply. "But we need to drill here." "Based on what evidence?" Thomas hesitated. How could he explain what had happened during the storm? Sarah dealt in science, in provable facts. She had invested everything in this venture based on rational analysis. "I had a vision," he finally said. "During the storm. This is where we'll find oil." Sarah's expression shifted from confusion to concern. "A vision? Thomas, we can't change our entire operation based on—" "I'm certain," he interrupted gently. "More certain than I've been about anything. The oil is here, beneath the stone circle." They stood in silence, the gulf between their worldviews suddenly very apparent. Thomas waited, understanding what he was asking of her. To set aside everything she believed in, to trust something she couldn't see or measure. Finally, Sarah looked from the stone circle to the clay lamp Thomas had left sitting on a nearby crate. "How did it burn?" she asked quietly. "Brightly," he answered. "Steadily." She nodded slowly. "One more attempt, then. Here." Thomas wiped his brow with a faded red bandana, leaving a streak of grime across his forehead. 3 days of relentless drilling had brought them to nearly 300 feet, deeper than they'd ever reached before. The new equipment, purchased with Sarah's money, performed admirably, though the work remained brutally demanding. "Another 20 feet today," Little Fox reported, helping to extract the drill for the evening inspection. Thomas nodded, examining the core samples as they emerged. The rock fragments showed increasing signs of petroleum presence, darker coloration, stronger odor. Sarah meticulously cataloged each sample, her scientific rigor undiminished despite following Thomas's spiritually guided location choice. "The geological signs are promising," she admitted, adjusting the lamp as daylight faded. "Though not what I would have expected in this formation." They had established a cautious truce regarding Thomas's vision. Sarah never directly acknowledged believing him, but neither did she question their change in direction. Results were beginning to justify his inexplicable certainty. That evening, after the workers departed, Thomas and Sarah sat beside a small fire, reviewing their progress. "If the petroleum indicators continue to increase at this rate," Sarah said, "we should reach a productive layer within days rather than weeks." Thomas nodded, staring into the flames. "There's something else. The vibrations have changed. I can feel it through the drilling cable." "Changed how?" "Like." He searched for words. "Like we're getting closer to something that's pushing back." Sarah studied him in the firelight. "That's not scientifically." "I know," Thomas interrupted gently. "But it's what I feel." Before she could respond, a low rumble passed beneath them. So subtle it might have been imagined. They exchanged glances. "Did you?" Sarah began. "Yes." Thomas rose, moving toward the derrick. "Something's happening." The ground emitted another tremor, slightly stronger. At the derrick's base, Thomas knelt and pressed his palm against the earth. The vibration was unmistakable now, a steady, rhythmic pulse. "We should halt drilling until morning," Sarah suggested, concern evident in her voice. Thomas shook his head. "No, we continue now. It's nearly dark. Now," he repeated with quiet intensity. "We're close." Something in his tone convinced her. With only lanterns to light their work, they restarted the drilling operation. Thomas took position at the controls while Sarah monitored the cable tension. The drill bit descended past the previous depth, encountering less resistance than expected. 310 feet, 320, 330. At 342 feet, the drill suddenly plunged several feet in an instant, as if breaking through a barrier. Thomas immediately signaled to stop. "We've hit a cavity," he called to Sarah. Before she could respond, the cable began to vibrate violently. Thomas moved to disengage the drill, but the shaking increased, traveling up the derrick's frame. The entire structure groaned under unexpected stress. "Pull it out," Sarah shouted. "Something's wrong." Thomas worked the winch frantically, beginning to extract the drill. The cable emerged foot by foot, shaking so violently it blurred in the lamplight. When the bit cleared the hole, a deep, thunderous rumble emanated from below. The ground around the derrick bulged upward, soil cracking in concentric circles. "Get back," Thomas shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her away from the structure. They had barely reached a safe distance when the earth erupted. A fountain of dark liquid shot skyward with explosive force, drenching the derrick and spraying outward in a black rain. The pressure was so intense it tore the drill assembly from its moorings, sending metal parts flying. Thomas instinctively pulled Sarah close, shielding her with his body as oil showered down around them. The bandana around his neck was instantly soaked as the black geyser continued to climb higher, silhouetted against the night sky. "My God," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the roar of the gusher. The oil rained down, turning the surrounding land into a dark mirror that reflected the stars above. The smell, that distinctive petroleum scent, was overwhelming. In the lantern light, the fountain appeared almost solid, a black column connecting earth and sky. They stood transfixed, watching as their months of work, struggle, and faith materialized in spectacular fashion. Thomas felt Sarah's hand find his, their fingers intertwining as oil continued to erupt with undiminished force. "We did it," she said, turning to him with wide eyes. Oil speckled her face like exotic war paint, but her smile shone through. "You were right." Thomas's response was lost as the gusher suddenly intensified, the pressure finding a new level. The derrick, already damaged, began to collapse under the onslaught. They backed further away, watching as years of planning and weeks of construction surrendered to the earth's release. "It's destroying everything," Sarah said. "No," Thomas replied, squeezing her hand. "It's just beginning." By morning, word had spread. The black fountain was visible for miles, a stark monument rising from the cursed land that everyone had mocked. The oil-soaked bandana remained around Thomas's neck, a tangible reminder of the moment everything changed. By sunset the following day, a small collection of business cards had accumulated on Thomas's makeshift desk. Representatives from Western Petroleum, Phoenix Oil Development, Transcontinental Resources, and a half-dozen others. Each card bore the name of a man in an expensive suit who had appeared at the site, surveyed the still-flowing gusher with calculating eyes, and made what they considered a generous offer. Thomas had listened politely to each one, accepting their cards without commitment. Their offers ranged from insultingly low to temptingly substantial, but all shared one common element: immediate cash in exchange for complete surrender of his rights. $50,000, Mr. Redpath, the latest visitor had said, a man named Harrison from California Oil Trust. Cash in hand today. For undeveloped reservation land, that's more than generous. Thomas had thanked him for his interest and promised to consider the proposal. What he didn't share was that the previous visitor had offered $75,000, or that Sarah had estimated the well's potential value at several million. Now, as the day's last visitor departed, Thomas watched the continuing spectacle of their discovery. The oil fountain had diminished somewhat, but still rose 30 feet above the shattered derrick, a black plume against the reddening sky. They needed to cap it properly before the valuable resource was wasted, but that required expertise and equipment they didn't yet possess. Sarah joined him, her normally neat appearance now as oil-stained as his own. They had worked without rest to salvage equipment and secure the site as best they could. 6 more tomorrow, she said, nodding toward the departing dust cloud. They've telegraphed ahead from town. Word travels fast. Faster than I expected. She frowned. The Bureau of Indian Affairs representative arrives the day after. That concerns me more than the oil men. Thomas nodded. The legal status of their discovery remained uncertain. His allotment deed granted surface rights, but mineral rights on reservation land existed in a gray area of federal law. Everything they had worked for could be jeopardized by a bureaucrat's interpretation. A wagon approached from the direction of the reservation, walking bare with several tribal members, their second visit since the strike. The elder had come at dawn, standing silently before the gusher for several minutes before speaking. The old powers have awakened, he had said simply. Now all will come, like coyotes to a carcass. His prediction was proving accurate. Beyond the oil company representatives, others had begun arriving. Curiosity seekers, laborers looking for work, even a photographer from Phoenix. The isolated parcel that no one had wanted now attracted dozens of daily visitors. Walking Bear's wagon stopped at a respectful distance. The old man descended slowly, accompanied by Gray Horse and several younger men. They approached with measured steps, their expressions a mixture of awe and concern as they regarded the still-flowing oil. The council has sent us, Walking Bear announced. They wish to know your intentions. My intentions haven't changed, Thomas replied. To use this discovery for the benefit of our people. Gray Horse spoke next, his voice barely audible above the gusher's constant roar. The agents have already come to the reservation, asking questions about your claim. They speak of government interest, of national resources. Thomas exchanged glances with Sarah. This was an anticipated complication, but arriving sooner than expected. What did you tell them? He asked. That the land was yours by legal allotment, Walking Bear answered. But they spoke of higher authorities, of Washington's concern. Before Thomas could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Sheriff Willard appeared with 2 deputies and a man in a government suit. Redpath, Willard called, reining in his mount. This is Mr. Davis from the Department of the Interior. He has questions about your operation here. The government man dismounted, surveying the scene with narrowed eyes. His gaze lingered on Sarah, then shifted to the tribal elders before finally settling on Thomas. "Quite a discovery, Mr. Redpath," he said, his tone professionally neutral. "I'm here to discuss certain legal considerations regarding mineral extraction on federal trust lands." "My allotment deed," Thomas began, "grants surface rights only," Davis interrupted smoothly. "Subsurface mineral rights remain vested with the federal government as trustee for the tribe. I'll need to see all your paperwork and survey documentation." Sarah stepped forward. "We have comprehensive records of our exploration and discovery process, Mr. Davis. Perhaps we could discuss this more comfortably in town, after Mr. Redpath has had time to gather the relevant documents." Davis considered her, surprised by her articulate intervention. "And you are Sarah Blackwood, Mr. Redpath's business partner." Davis's eyebrows rose slightly. "I see. Well, Mrs. Blackwood, I'm afraid this matter requires immediate attention. The Bureau has concerns about unauthorized extraction of mineral resources." "Nothing has been extracted or sold," Thomas pointed out. "We've only confirmed its presence." Davis gestured toward the flowing gusher. "That appears to be extraction, regardless of intent. I'll need to post federal agents here until ownership is clarified." As the confrontation unfolded, Thomas noticed a man observing from a distance, expensively dressed, taking notes. Another vulture circling, waiting for weakness. The business cards in his pocket suddenly felt heavier. Each represented a different way to lose control of what he and Sarah had discovered, through quick money, legal maneuvering, or government intervention. But Thomas Redpath had not come this far to surrender now. The law book's leather cover was worn at the edges, its pages marked with dozens of paper slips. Indian law and mineral rights, federal statutes and case precedents, had become Sarah's constant companion over the past week. She had obtained it through a friend at the Territorial University, and its contents had proven both illuminating and disturbing. "The Curtis Act of 1898, she read aloud, seated across from Thomas in the small office they'd rented in town. "It specifically addresses mineral leases on Indian territory in Oklahoma, but Arizona territory falls under different statutes." Thomas studied the temporary injunction tacked to the wall, the government's first official move to assert control over their discovery. The gusher had been capped 3 days earlier by specialists from California, hired at considerable expense. Now armed guards from the Bureau of Indian Affairs patrolled the site while ownership was disputed. "What about the case in South Dakota?" Thomas asked. "The one where the LAD retained mineral rights?" Sarah flipped to another marked page. "Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock, unfortunately, establishes Congress's plenary power over tribal lands, even those allotted to individuals." She sighed, removing her reading glasses. "The legal precedent isn't in our favor." Their only ally in the legal battle had appeared unexpectedly, a young lawyer named Michael Calloway who had approached them after the injunction was filed. His specialty was Indian law, and his interest in their case seemed driven by principle rather than profit. "Calloway believes we can argue that the General Allotment Act implies mineral rights transfer with the land," Thomas said, "unless explicitly reserved." "A novel argument," Sarah acknowledged, "but will it stand against the government's position?" The door opened, and Calloway himself entered, looking weary but determined. At 30, he was younger than most attorneys, with an earnestness that initially made Thomas skeptical but had since proven genuine. "The hearing is set for next Tuesday," he announced, setting his briefcase on the desk. "Judge Patterson will preside." "Patterson?" Sarah's expression fell. "He's notoriously sympathetic to government positions." "Yes, but he's also a stickler for precise legal language." Calloway extracted documents from his case. "I found something interesting in your original allotment deed, Mr. Redpath." Thomas leaned forward as the lawyer spread the deed on the desk. "The standard reservation of rights clause is incomplete." Calloway pointed to the relevant paragraph. It reserves timber and water rights to the government, but makes no specific mention of minerals or oil. An oversight? Sarah asked. Perhaps, but legally significant. We can argue that if the government intended to reserve mineral rights, they should have specified them as they did with timber and water. It was a slender thread of hope, but more than they'd had previously. Outside their office window, Thomas could see the territorial courthouse where their fate would be decided. An imposing stone building representing a legal system designed by and for the white settlers. What about the tribal council's position? Thomas asked. Their claim that the oil belongs to all Apache people? Calloway's expression grew more serious. That complicates matters. If they file as interested parties, it creates a three-way dispute. You, the federal government, and the tribe. Have they filed? Sarah asked. Not yet, but there's pressure from both sides. Some council members support your claim, others want tribal ownership. The tribal division had been evident since the discovery. Many saw Thomas as fighting for Apache rights against government overreach. Others believed he was claiming communal resources for personal gain. Walking Bear had warned him that even his supporters were wavering as government agents whispered promises of tribal benefits if they opposed his claim. There's another concern, Calloway continued. Consolidated Western Oil has been meeting with Interior Department officials in Washington. They're proposing legislation that would explicitly define all mineral rights on Indian lands as federal property. They can't change the law retroactively, Sarah protested. They might not need to. If they can delay our case long enough for the legislation to pass, it would strengthen their position considerably. Thomas rose and moved to the window, watching people pass on the street below. Many now recognized him, the Apache who had found oil on worthless land. Some nodded respectfully. Others stared with undisguised resentment or curiosity. We need to resolve this quickly, he said finally, before they can change the rules. There might be another approach, Calloway suggested cautiously. Several oil companies have expressed interest in filing amicus briefs supporting your position. Why would they support me over the government? Thomas asked skeptically. Because they'd rather negotiate with an individual aladi than navigate federal bureaucracy. They're offering legal support in exchange for future considerations. You mean drilling rights? Sarah translated. Yes, particularly Southwestern Independent. They're smaller than Consolidated Western but have political connections of their own. Thomas turned from the window. We maintain controlling interest? They're proposing a 60-40 split in your favor, with guaranteed Apache employment and infrastructure development. It wasn't ideal, but it offered a path forward, powerful allies against the government's seemingly unlimited resources. Thomas glanced at Sarah, who gave a slight nod of agreement. Arrange a meeting, he told Calloway, but make it clear we're considering options, not making commitments. After the lawyer departed, Thomas and Sarah remained in thoughtful silence. The law book between them represented both opportunity and obstacle, a system that could protect their rights or strip them away entirely, depending on its interpretation. We're being outmaneuvered, Sarah said finally. On legal grounds, at least. Thomas nodded slowly. Then perhaps it's time to change the battlefield. The sabotaged valve lay on the table between Thomas and Sheriff Willard, its brass fitting deliberately scored with deep grooves. Had it remained in place when they reopened the well for testing, the pressure would have shattered it, potentially causing a catastrophic explosion. Found it during the morning inspection, Thomas explained. Someone replaced the original valve overnight. Willard picked up the damaged piece, examining it with feigned interest. Could have been an accident. Equipment failure. This was precision work, Thomas countered. Designed to look intact until under pressure. They were meeting in the sheriff's office in town, a week after their court hearing had been postponed on a technicality. The legal battle had become a war of attrition. Delays, procedural objections, and endless filings that drained their financial resources and tested their patience. Meanwhile, the sabotage attempts had escalated from vandalized equipment to potentially deadly tampering. "What exactly do you expect me to do, Redpath?" Willard sighed, setting down the valve. "Post deputies at your site round the clock? For a property dispute." "This isn't vandalism," Thomas said evenly. "It's attempted murder. That's a serious accusation. Got any proof who did this?" Thomas didn't, though suspicions pointed to Consolidated Western Oil, the company most aggressively pursuing government control of the site. Their representative, a cold-eyed man named Blackwood, no relation to Sarah, had made thinly veiled threats during failed negotiations. "This is the third incident," Thomas reminded the sheriff. "First the cut derrick cables, then the contaminated water supply, now this. And each time you found the problem before anyone got hurt," Willard observed. "Seems like you're handling security just fine." The sheriff's indifference was expected but still infuriating. Thomas retrieved the sabotaged valve and left without further argument. Outside, he found Little Fox waiting with their horses. "The sheriff will do nothing," Thomas reported as they mounted. Little Fox nodded grimly. "As we expected." The young Apache had organized a rotating guard of tribal members to watch the site, supplementing the government agents who seemed conveniently absent whenever sabotage occurred. Riding back to the property, Thomas noted 2 new tents had appeared on adjacent land, surveyors working for Consolidated Western, maintaining constant observation. Sarah was at the capped wellhead with Michael Calloway when they arrived. The lawyer had been documenting the sabotage incidents, building a separate case against whoever was responsible. "The sheriff?" Sarah asked, though Thomas's expression already gave the answer. "Claims his jurisdiction is limited on reservation allotments," Thomas replied. "Convenient." Calloway finished his photographs and joined them. "This pattern of intimidation actually strengthens our position in court. It suggests our claim has substantial merit." "Small comfort if someone gets killed," Sarah said. That evening, after Calloway departed, Thomas and Sarah reviewed their security measures. The capped well was their primary concern. Any tampering could release the tremendous pressure still building below, with devastating consequences. "We need professional guards," Sarah insisted. "People with experience." "And who would we trust?" Thomas countered. "Every security firm in the territory has connections to either the government or the oil companies." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of several riders. Thomas reached for his rifle, but relaxed upon recognizing Walking Bear among the group. The tribal elder dismounted slowly, his face grave. With him were 6 Apache men, including Gray Horse's son, Joseph, who had attended university in California. "The council has reached a decision," Walking Bear announced without preamble. "We will file as interested parties in your case." Thomas felt his heart sink. If the tribe opposed his claim, his position would be significantly weakened. "Against me?" he asked quietly. "No," Walking Bear surprised him. "In support. The council believes your rights as an LAD should be upheld, with conditions." Joseph stepped forward. "The tribe wants guaranteed participation, jobs, training, and a percentage of profits dedicated to reservation improvements." It was more than Thomas had dared hope for. "Those were always my intentions." "There's more," Walking Bear continued. "Until the court decides, these men will guard your discovery, day and night." The 6 Apache men stood tall, several with military experience evident in their bearing. Their presence would make further sabotage significantly more difficult. "Thank you," Thomas said sincerely. "This support means—" "It is not just support," Walking Bear interrupted. "It is survival. If they can take your rights, they can take all of ours." Later, as Thomas and Sarah walked the perimeter with Joseph, discussing guard positions, a reflection caught Thomas's eye from the ridge where the surveyors camped. The unmistakable glint of a rifle scope in the setting sun. "Down!" Thomas shouted, pulling Sarah to the ground as a shot cracked across the property. The bullet struck a metal drum beside where they had been standing. Joseph and the other Apache guards responded immediately, taking cover and returning fire toward the ridge. The exchange lasted only moments before the unseen shooter retreated. When they deemed it safe to move, Thomas examined the drum. The bullet had pierced it cleanly, a precise shot that would have struck him had he not noticed the reflection. "They're escalating," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the close call. Thomas nodded grimly. "The hearing is in 3 days. They're getting desperate." The sabotaged valve had been a warning. The bullet was a declaration of war. As darkness fell, Thomas watched the Apache guards take their positions around the property, silhouettes against the twilight sky. The legal battle would continue in courtrooms and offices, but this bullets and sabotage was the truth behind the polite negotiations and legal filings. Someone would kill to control what lay beneath his land. Thomas checked his rifle, then joined the guards. Tonight, he would stand watch with his people. The council pipe passed from hand to hand, each elder taking a ceremonial puff before speaking their mind. Thomas sat cross-legged in the circle, acutely aware of the weight of tradition and the unprecedented nature of this gathering. Beside him sat Sarah, the first white person ever invited to a formal tribal council meeting, her presence both controversial and necessary. The great cottonwood tree spread its branches above them, the same tree where months earlier the elders had warned Thomas against disturbing the cursed land. Now that land's secrets had been revealed, forcing the tribe to confront questions about ownership, progress, and their future. Gray Horse, as eldest, spoke first after the pipe returned to him. "We face a decision unlike any in our history. The black water Thomas Redpath has found could bring great wealth or great suffering." Nods of agreement rippled through the circle. Beyond the elders sat dozens of tribal members, listening intently. The entire reservation had gathered for this momentous discussion. "The government says this treasure belongs to them," Gray Horse continued. "The oil companies say it should be theirs to take. Thomas Redpath says the allotment makes it his discovery." He fixed Thomas with a penetrating gaze. "But what say you now, Thomas Redpath? Do you claim this wealth for yourself alone?" The question hung in the air, direct and unavoidable. Thomas had prepared for this moment, knowing his answer would determine not just his future but potentially that of the entire tribe. "The land was given to me," Thomas began carefully. "The discovery came through my work and Sarah's knowledge. By white man's law, that grants me certain rights." He paused, looking around the circle. "But I am Apache first. What comes from Apache land should benefit all Apache people." A murmur passed through the gathering. Thomas continued, "I propose a tribal cooperative. My legal claim would secure our rights against outside interests, but the benefits would be shared. Schools built with oil money, water systems, healthcare, jobs for our people in the operation." Walking Bear spoke next. "Fine words, but how would this work? Would you still control this wealth?" Thomas glanced at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. "We have consulted with attorneys who specialize in such arrangements. A formal trust could be established, with representatives chosen by the council to ensure fair distribution." Joseph, Gray Horse's son, leaned forward. "And what would prevent the government from simply taking control, as they have with other tribal resources?" "Nothing is certain," Thomas acknowledged. "But our position is strongest when united. My individual claim combined with tribal interest creates legal protections that neither would have alone." The discussion continued as the sun arced overhead. Some elders expressed skepticism about working within white legal structures at all. Others worried about corruption if sudden wealth flowed to the reservation. Several younger voices supported Thomas's vision of economic independence. Throughout, Sarah remained silent until directly addressed by Mourning Dove, who asked what a white woman sought from this arrangement. "I seek what I have always sought," Sarah replied with quiet dignity. To apply knowledge for the benefit of those who have been denied opportunity, and to honor my late husband's belief that this territory's resources should serve its people, all its people. Her words carried weight, especially among those who had witnessed her commitment through months of hardship and danger. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Gray Horse raised his hand for silence. We have heard all voices. Now we must decide. The traditional method followed, each elder placing a white or black stone in a basket to signify support or opposition. Thomas watched, expressionless, as the voting proceeded. Sarah's hand found his, out of sight of the others, and squeezed gently. When Gray Horse appended the basket to count, the white stones outnumbered black by a narrow margin. It is decided, he announced. The council will support Thomas Redpath's legal claim, with the condition that a tribal cooperative be established as described. 5 elders will be chosen to oversee the tribe's interests. Relief washed through Thomas, though he maintained his composure. This was only one obstacle overcome, with many battles still ahead. As the council dispersed, Walking Bear approached Thomas and Sarah. You have your alliance, the old man said. Now comes the true test. The court hearing, Thomas nodded. Not just the white man's court, Walking Bear replied. The test of whether what you unleashed brings blessing or curse to our people. He glanced meaningfully at the ceremonial pipe, now extinguished. The smoke carries our agreement to the ancestors. Do not forget this is their land first. That evening, as Thomas and Sarah rode back toward the oil site, she broke their thoughtful silence. What happens if we lose in court, despite tribal support? Thomas considered the question, watching the setting sun paint the desert in hues of orange and gold, the same colors as fire, as danger. Then we find another way, he said finally. There's always another way. Ahead, they could see the capped wellhead, surrounded by Apache guards keeping vigilant watch. Tomorrow would bring the court hearing that might decide everything or nothing. But today, they had secured something perhaps more valuable, the unified voice of a people too often divided by outside forces. As darkness fell, Thomas touched the medicine pouch still hanging around his neck. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Not just he and Sarah, but an entire tribe standing behind their claim. Thomas's rifle felt heavy in his hands as he crouched behind the stone outcropping. The weapon, his father's old Winchester, had been used only for hunting until tonight. Now it was trained on the shadowy figures approaching from the north ridge, their intentions clear in their furtive movements. The court hearing had gone poorly. Judge Patterson had seemed ready to rule against them when Calloway produced a surprise witness, a former Interior Department official who testified about backdoor negotiations between Consolidated Western and government representatives. The judge, visibly disturbed by the allegations, had called a 3-day recess to review new evidence. Those 3 days had apparently been enough for Consolidated Western to decide on more direct action. 8 men at least, whispered Joseph, peering through field glasses. Professional gunmen by the look of them. Thomas nodded grimly. Their own defenses consisted of 6 Apache guards, himself, and 3 tribal members who had volunteered when word of possible trouble spread. Sarah had been sent to town under escort to alert Calloway and attempt to reach the territorial governor by telegraph. They'll try for the wellhead, Thomas said quietly. We hold that position at all costs. The capped well represented everything. Their claim, their future, the tribe's opportunity. If destroyed or damaged, their legal position would be severely weakened. Thomas had no illusions about Consolidated Western strategy. Create a situation that would require federal intervention, then manipulate that intervention to their advantage. Signal the others, he instructed Joseph. No shooting until they make their intentions clear. A few moments later, a flicker of lamplight from different positions confirmed their defenders were in place, surrounding the wellhead in a protective formation. The night was moonless, the darkness broken only by stars, and the distant glow of a small fire they deliberately left burning as a distraction. Thomas checked his father's watch, nearly midnight. The waiting stretched each minute into seeming hours. The first shot came without warning, a sharp crack followed by the ping of metal striking metal. Someone had fired at the wellhead's pressure gauge. "They're showing their hand," Joseph muttered. Thomas raised his rifle but held his fire. Wait for them to advance. The attackers grew bolder, sending a volley of shots toward the wellhead. At Joseph's signal, the Apache defenders returned fire, targeting the muzzle flashes on the ridge. The exchange was brief but intense. A period of tense silence followed before Thomas detected movement, shadows detaching from the ridge and advancing toward the well in a scattered pattern. "They're coming in," he warned through a soft bird call that carried to the other defenders. The gunmen were professionals, using the terrain for cover as they approached. When they were approximately 50 yards from the wellhead, Joseph gave the signal to open fire. The night erupted in gunshots and shouted commands as the attackers sought cover and returned fire. Thomas held his position, firing only when he had a clear target. Their strategy was defensive, hold the attackers at bay until help could arrive. Sarah had promised to send riders to the nearest cavalry outpost if she couldn't reach officials by telegraph. Time blurred as the gunfight continued in sporadic bursts. Thomas was repositioning when a bullet struck the rock beside him, sending stone fragments into his cheek. He dropped lower, blood warm on his face. "Thomas!" Joseph called from nearby. Two circling east. Wiping blood from his eye, Thomas spotted the flanking maneuver. Two men using a dry wash to approach the wellhead from behind. He moved quickly through the brush, intercepting them at a narrow point in the wash. His first shot struck one man in the shoulder, sending him sprawling. The second dove for cover behind a boulder. "This isn't your fight, Apache," the man called. "Walk away with your people. This is business." "My business," Thomas replied, keeping his rifle trained on the boulder. Consolidated Western pays well for cooperation. Better than dying for a piece of paper. Thomas didn't respond, focusing instead on the slight movement visible at the boulder's edge. When the gunman made his move, Thomas was ready. His shot caught the man in the leg, dropping him with a pained shout. As Thomas secured the wounded attackers, a new sound carried across the desert. Hoofbeats, many horses approaching fast. He tensed, uncertain whether this meant reinforcements for either side. Joseph appeared beside him. Riders coming. A lot of them. They retreated to defensive positions, watching as a large group approached from the direction of town. As they drew closer, Thomas recognized Sheriff Willard at the front, alongside Walking Bear and at least 20 Apache riders. "Hold fire!" Thomas called to his defenders. "It's the sheriff." The arrival of law enforcement and additional tribal members quickly changed the dynamic. The remaining attackers, seeing themselves outnumbered, retreated to the ridge. Two were captured, including one of the men Thomas had wounded. Sheriff Willard dismounted, surveying the scene with obvious reluctance. "Quite a situation you've got, Redpath. Armed men attacking my legal property," Thomas replied evenly. "Seems straightforward. They're claiming they were defending Consolidated Western survey equipment from Apache raiders," Willard countered, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. Walking Bear stepped forward. "The Reservation Council received warning from Mrs. Blackwood. We voted to defend our interests." The sheriff looked uncomfortable at the unified front presented by Thomas and the tribal representatives. "This complicates matters. Actually, it simplifies them," came a new voice. Sarah rode into the lamplight, accompanied by Calloway and another man Thomas didn't recognize. "Sheriff, may I present Mr. James Thornton, Special Investigator for the Governor's Office." The newcomer nodded curtly. "Sheriff Willard, I've been tasked with investigating allegations of corporate interference in territorial affairs. These events will be of particular interest to the governor." Thomas caught Sarah's eye, reading in her expression that something significant had shifted in their favor. The wounded attackers were being treated and loaded into a wagon as evidence of the night's events. The wellhead, Thomas asked Joseph quietly. Secure. Some damage to auxiliary equipment, but the main cap is intact. As dawn broke over the desert, Thomas stood with Sarah and Walking Bear, watching as the sheriff and investigator documented the scene. His father's rifle rested across his arm, a tool of survival that had served its purpose. You were right, Sarah said softly. They were getting desperate. Thomas nodded. And now they've shown their hand. Walking Bear gestured toward the rising sun. The ancestors watched over us tonight. But this fight is not finished. No, Thomas agreed. But for the first time, I believe we might win it. The contract lay open on the polished mahogany table, its carefully worded clauses representing weeks of negotiation and countless revisions. Unlike the business cards Thomas had collected during those first days after the strike, this document offered terms that recognized both his legal rights and the tribe's interests. 55% ownership retained by the Apache Cooperative Development Trust, read Nathan Porter, president of Horizon Oil Company. 45% operational stake to Horizon, with all infrastructure. Development to include local hiring at prevailing wages. Thomas and Sarah exchanged glances across the table. The Phoenix Law Office where they met had become familiar territory during the month since the armed confrontation at the well. The attempted attack had dramatically altered their circumstances, turning public opinion in their favor and triggering investigations that revealed Consolidated Western's extensive corruption. Judge Patterson had ruled decisively in their favor 3 weeks earlier, upholding Thomas's mineral rights with the provision that the tribal cooperative agreement be formalized. Governor Marshall himself had attended the signing ceremony, eager to associate with what newspapers were calling the most significant discovery in territorial history. Now came the practical phase, finding a partner to develop the oil field properly. They had interviewed 6 companies before settling on Horizon, a newer operation with a reputation for fair dealings with landowners. Page 12 outlines the Community Development Fund, Porter continued. 3% of gross production dedicated to reservation improvements, schools, water systems, medical facilities, with disbursement controlled by the Tribal Council. Walking Bear, representing the council, nodded slowly. His initial skepticism had gradually transformed into cautious support as the cooperative framework took shape. And the environmental protections? Sarah prompted. Porter turned to the relevant section. As requested, containment systems exceeding territorial requirements, quarterly water testing of surrounding aquifers, and restoration of any land disturbed beyond the main production area. These provisions had been Sarah's priority, informed by the environmental degradation she had witnessed in other oil regions. Though such requirements were unusual, Horizon had agreed rather than lose the opportunity. What about training programs? Thomas asked. Our people need skills to participate fully. Page 17, Porter replied. Apprenticeship positions in all operational departments, with educational scholarships for advanced technical training. The negotiations continued for another hour, addressing smaller details and clarifying obligations. When all questions had been answered, Thomas, Sarah, and Walking Bear stepped into the hallway for a private conversation. It is a good agreement, Walking Bear acknowledged. Better than I expected from any white man's company. They need us more than we need them, Sarah pointed out. Without access to our oil, they remain a minor player in the industry. Thomas considered all they had achieved and all that remained uncertain. We still face opposition. Consolidated Western has powerful allies in Washington. True, Sarah agreed. But we have something more valuable, a model that works for everyone. If this succeeds, other tribes might follow our example. Walking Bear's weathered face revealed rare optimism. When I was a young man, I saw our land shrink with each government treaty. I never imagined we might reclaim our future through the white man's own legal system. They returned to the conference room, where Porter waited patiently. The signing proceeded with appropriate ceremony, each party initialing every page before adding their final signatures to the last. As Thomas completed his signature, he felt the weight of history, personal and tribal, in the moment. "Congratulations," Porter said, extending his hand first to Thomas, then to Sarah and Walking Bear. "I believe we've just made history." Outside the law office, Phoenix bustled with the energy of a growing city. Thomas paused on the steps, watching people hurry past. Businessmen, laborers, families. None recognized him as the Apache who had changed the territory's economic landscape, though his name now appeared regularly in newspapers. "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked, joining him. "About transformation," he replied. "The land everyone called cursed has become blessed. The Apache who everyone mocked is now courted by businessmen and politicians. And the schoolteacher who lost her position has become a petroleum development consultant," Sarah added with a smile. Their partnership had evolved alongside their business venture. The shared struggles had forged a bond that transcended conventional relationships. Though they maintained appropriate public discretion, their private understanding had deepened into something neither had anticipated when they first examined soil samples together. As they descended the steps, Walking Bear pointed to a newspaper boy on the corner. The headline announced, "Territorial Legislature passes new mineral rights protections." "Your fight changes more than just our reservation," the elder observed. "It changes the rules themselves." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. They had won more than ownership of one oil well. They had established principles that might protect others facing similar struggles. That evening, as Thomas reviewed a copy of the signed contract in Sarah's small house, he reflected on the journey. From a ridiculed dream to a formal partnership with one of the most progressive companies in the industry. From isolation to leadership of a tribal cooperative that promised genuine prosperity. "To new beginnings," Sarah said, raising her teacup in a mock toast. Thomas smiled, raising his own cup to meet hers. "And to curses that become blessings." Outside, the first equipment wagons were already departing for the well site, carrying the tools that would transform a lonely patch of worthless reservation land into the future of the Apache people. The silver and turquoise pendant caught the morning light as Thomas fastened it around Sarah's neck. His grandmother's design recreated by tribal craftsmen. The piece symbolized their union, blue stones from the earth embraced by polished silver, traditional patterns meeting modern form. "It's beautiful," Sarah whispered, touching the pendant gently. "Like its wearer," Thomas replied, a rare display of sentiment that brought color to her cheeks. They stood in the shade of the great cottonwood, the same tree that had witnessed tribal councils for generations. Today it overlooked a different kind of gathering. Their wedding ceremony, blending Apache traditions with elements Sarah had requested from her own heritage. 1 year had passed since oil erupted from the cursed land. 1 year of transformation so profound that the reservation was nearly unrecognizable, yet somehow more authentically itself than it had been in decades. Where once stood scattered dwellings and struggling gardens, now a planned community took shape. The school building, completed just last month, gleamed with fresh paint and new equipment. The medical clinic, staffed by 2 doctors from Phoenix, had already reduced infant mortality. Water pipelines brought clean water to every home, ending the daily treks to distant wells. Most significant was the change in the people themselves. Employment had reached nearly full capacity between the oil operation and the new support businesses. Young Apache men and women who had left seeking opportunity elsewhere were returning, bringing skills and education back to the community. The wedding guests represented this new reality. Tribal members in both traditional dress and modern attire, Horizon Oil employees who had become friends rather than just business associates, territorial officials including Governor Marshall himself, and even a few reformed skeptics from town who had initially mocked Thomas's venture. Who would have imagined this outcome when you took that unwanted allotment? Walking Bear mused, joining them after the ceremony as guests moved toward the celebration feast. Thomas surveyed the scene. Oil derricks visible in the distance, new buildings rising closer by, and between them, his people walking with a dignity born of self-determination rather than dependence. The land was never cursed, he reflected. It was waiting for the right person to listen to it, Sarah added, her hand finding his. Gray Horse approached slowly, supported by his son Joseph. The eldest of the tribal elders had initially been the most skeptical of Thomas's plans. Now he came bearing a small leather pouch. For both of you, he said, his voice thin but clear. Earth from the sacred circle where the wealth was found. A reminder that what comes from the ground must honor the ground. Thomas accepted the gift with appropriate reverence. The oil operation had carefully preserved the stone circle, creating their main facility around it rather than disturbing the ancient formation. As the celebration continued into the afternoon, Thomas and Sarah found a moment alone, watching children play a game with hoops and sticks, traditional pastimes continuing despite the modern world encroaching. Consolidated Western's executives were indicted yesterday, Sarah mentioned, having received the telegram just that morning. Federal charges of corruption and attempted murder. Thomas nodded. Justice had been slow but thorough. The investigation triggered by the armed attack had uncovered extensive bribery and illegal arrangements throughout the territory. And our production figures? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Exceeding projections by 15%, Sarah replied with satisfaction. The second well is already producing, and geological surveys suggest the field extends farther than we initially thought. Their technical discussions came easily now. The partnership that began with tentative soil analysis had matured into seamless collaboration. Sarah's scientific knowledge complemented Thomas's practical experience and intuitive understanding of the land. As sunset approached, tribal elders prepared for a special ceremony, one that hadn't been performed in generations. The blessing of new beginnings, Walking Bear had explained, was reserved for moments when the tribe's future took a significant turn. The ceremony began with drums and singing, ancient songs carrying into the twilight. Thomas and Sarah stood within the circle of elders, representatives of the bridge between worlds that had made this prosperity possible. Morning Dove approached with a clay bowl containing a mixture of corn pollen, cedar ash, and now, in recognition of their new reality, a drop of oil from the first well. The ancestors could not have foreseen this path, she said as she marked their foreheads with the mixture. But they prepared us to recognize opportunity when it appeared, dressed in unexpected forms. Later, as stars emerged in the desert sky, Thomas and Sarah walked to the ridge where he had once stood alone, contemplating a piece of land nobody wanted. The view had changed dramatically. Electric lights from the oil operation and new reservation buildings created a constellation on the ground to mirror those above. What do you see now, when you look at your cursed land? Sarah asked softly. Thomas considered the question, his arm around his wife's shoulders. Below them stretched not just an oil field, but a future, schools where Apache children would learn both traditional knowledge and modern skills. A clinic where their health would be tended, homes where families could thrive. I see proof, he replied finally, that some curses are just blessings in disguise, waiting for someone stubborn enough to uncover them. Sarah leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. Or perhaps, she suggested, waiting for someone who could see with both eyes, traditional wisdom and modern knowledge together. As they turned to walk back toward their new home, Thomas realized the land had never been the cursed one. It had been his people, trapped between worlds, neither fully traditional nor accepted in the new order. What he and Sarah had discovered was more valuable than oil, a way forward that honored the past while embracing the future. The medicine pouch still hung around his neck, a reminder of the journey. But the real protection had never been the sacred objects or ancient prayers. It had been the wisdom to recognize that progress without roots creates nothing of lasting value. And in that understanding lay their true legacy.